So probably the first place to start is really, what is a wetland? And we can get all technical and pull up the government definition, which states that, were you ready for this? Lands that are seasonally or permanently covered by shallow water, as well as lands where the water table is close or at the surface. In either case, the abundance of water has caused the formation of hydric soils and has favored the dominance of either hydrophytic or water-tolerant plants. But we don't need to do that. We can scale that down and really say water, mud, and aquatic plants. You don't have to have wet feet to be in a wetland. If we have aquatic plants, then we're standing in a wetland. There's 4 wetland types in Ontario that we look at. Probably the classic wetland would be the marsh. And the marsh is really the one with the lily pads, the open water, the cattails that we have out there. In this case, with the marsh, there's water. It is stagnant enough that we've got aquatic plants, but there's still oxygen coming into that wetland. And so at the end of the season, when the plants die, they go to the bottom and they rot. However, if it was a little more stagnant than that, what might happen is at the end of the season, the plants might fall over, but there's just not enough oxygen for the plants to rot in time. So you start to get this buildup, this mat buildup, and this mat would creep across the surface. And underneath that mat would be this partially decayed plant material that we call peat. Then we really moved on to a second type of wetland. You might recognize it by having little plants like bog rosemary or sphagnum moss. Stunted tamarack might be on that mat of vegetation. A little more stagnant than that actually is the bog. And in this case, you've still got that mat of vegetation and that underlying peat. But that sphagnum moss is built up and you've got big hummocks of sphagnum moss, so it would be tough to walk across. The black tamarack has been pushed to the side and you've got black spruce, sort of stunted black spruce scattered about. The bog laurels and the sheep laurels and the mountain holly might be there, as well as the tawny cotton grass. So fens and bogs, although they don't have a high amount of a number of plants in them, the plants are there unique, different, and so they add to the biodiversity in the landscape overall. The fourth type of wetland is a swamp. And swamps are very, very diverse. Essentially, they are treed wetlands. They can be dominated by alder, speckled alder, and that's a very tough wetland to walk through, obviously. It's just a complete tangle of shrubs. But that's very different from a black spruce swamp. That's a coniferous swamp with a thick layer of sphagnum moss underneath. Now, that's very important to wildlife in the wintertime. They'll go to that because the snow's trapped in the canopy and it's that much warmer inside of a nice coniferous swamp like that. So it offers a lot of thermal refuge for wildlife. And then a very rich swamp would be something like this. This is a black ash swamp. Black ash, red maple, silver maple, very rich swamps. But again, all these swamps are dominated by trees or shrubs. What are the values of wetlands? Why are we talking about wetlands at all? An obvious one would be wildlife habitat. Wetlands provide a tremendous amount of wildlife habitat. They really are a transition zone between uplands and an aquatic habitat. So you get both upland species, aquatic species, and semi-aquatic species all utilizing them. Take turtles, for example, would be using them for hibernation and foraging, refuge. Waterfowl, nesting, breeding, brooding. Our upland species, like the moose, might come down to a wetland to spend the summer, feed on pondweed. As well as we talked about the biodiversity associated with a fen or a bog and how you get different and unique species. White-fringed orcs are only found in a bog, so it adds to the biodiversity in the landscape. Groundwater recharge is an important thing to think about a wetland. A wetland really essentially is a pool of water in the landscape. And over time, that water is going to just infiltrate right down into the soils and recharge the groundwater table. And it's really important for landowners to get this into their heads. I've talked to some that have spent sort of the afternoon, hauling all this debris and garbage out into the back swamp where, all those mosquitoes are, and filling up this back area. And then after all that hard work, sort of wiping their brow and going in and filling up their glass of water from their tap. And they're just not putting that together, that they've just spent the afternoon putting garbage in the water that's filtering down into the groundwater, which is coming up over to their well and straight up into their cup. That link is really important to put together just to understand that wetlands really do recharge the groundwater, the very water that we drink. In some cases, wetlands do offer an area for groundwater discharge, where water might percolate up to the surface, come into a wetland, and then flow down the watercourse, providing clean, cool water for other wildlife species. Water quality. Wetlands also have the ability to enhance water quality or protect water quality. And this is a good example. Here we've got a big excavation happening right adjacent to a wetland, which is then adjacent to a part of a big lake. In this case, the first rain that happens, we're going to get water flowing over that upland, picking up a whole bunch of sediment and silt, and taking it right into the lake. This wetland here has the ability to capture and filter out some of that sediment and silt, thereby protecting the adjacent fish habitat that could be damaged by that sediment. Wetlands also have the ability to consume nutrients and lock nutrients and other contaminants that might be coming from our uplands. Water quantity. Every winter, our uplands are filling with 1, 2, 3, 4 feet of snow. And what happens is in the spring, when that first melt happens, all that water rushes down out of our uplands and straight into our water bodies. Without wetlands, that water would just continue straight on to Lake Ontario and Georgian Bay and be there within days. Wetlands have the ability, first of all, the physical structure of the wetland can actually slow down the water and protect small towns like Minden from flooding. But they also, in the case of a bog or a fen, that mat of vegetation can often contain 2 meters of sphagnum moss, which is really just acts as one big sponge and just soaks up all that water, holds onto it. And then as the landscape dries and we lose our water from the landscape, it can release that water, keeping our landscape moist and our lakes full. As we lose wetlands, we become more and more dependent on dams and things to try and do what wetlands do. Recreation, obviously huge recreational values to wetlands. We've got I think Hike Halliburton had just had a Y Wetlands hike out there yesterday. So lots of recreation opportunities from fishing, waterfowl hunting, nature appreciation, bird watching, frog hunting and dragonfly hunting, canoeing, lots of recreational opportunities in wetlands. With recreation, of course, comes tourism, which is very important to the County of Halliburton, certainly. And there are some resources that we can get from wetlands as well. White cedar, that canoe is full of wild rice. Some of our berries, cranberry and blueberry, are harvested from wetlands. Cranberry tends to be in a fen or a bog, and I think Bella is the cranberry capital of Ontario. The provincial government recognizes these functions and features of wetlands, and what they've done is they've developed the Ontario Wetland Evaluation System. This system looks at 4 main components: a biological component, hydrological component, cultural components, and then a special features component. Each of these components are scored out of 250 points, and if a wetland scores over 600 points in total, then the wetland's deemed provincially significant. The provincial policy statement kicks in and states that any wetland that is provincially significant, no development is allowed within that wetland, and any development within 120 meters of that wetland is subject to an environmental impact statement, which states there'll be no detrimental impacts to the wetland. In the County of Halliburton right now, I think we've got about 6 or 7 different provincially significant wetlands identified now. However, it's important to understand that only 6 or 7 have actually been evaluated. And I think the last estimate in the County of Halliburton, we had about 20,000 wetlands. So, so a bit of a ways to go. So, wetlands today. I think as a community, we're constantly struggling with economic challenges, and it's often hard to justify wetland conservation. But once we understand that the ecological and hydrological services provided by wetlands in terms of water quality, water quantity, wildlife habitat, and biodiversity, the social values, recreation, resources, and tourism, I think we start to think that, and the interconnectedness of all of those, I think we start to understand that wetland conservation really isn't an extravagance, but essential for our well-being and the health of our landscape.